My name is Adam Driscoll, and today we are going to take a deep dive into PowerShell Universal Dashboard. I've seen this slide a couple times. Sponsors made it possible for us to be here. I'm Adam Driscoll. If you don't know who I am, I have been a Microsoft MVP for a decade now. I am the founder of Ironman Software. I started with PowerShell tools for Visual Studio. I've made PowerShell Pro Tools, now PowerShell Universal Dashboard. I'm an author, YouTuber, blogger, all kinds of stuff around PowerShell. I'm also a cyclist. We're about to do a trip in Italy after this to do some cycling up in the Dolomites, and outdoor enthusiast. Ever since I moved to Idaho in the United States, I've spent a lot of time outside. So speaking of Idaho, it was a very long trip to get here. I had a lot of problems, and it took a total of 53 hours, so I didn't sleep for almost 2 days. But remember that 53 hours, that'll be important at the end of this. So, PowerShell Universal Dashboard, a misnomer from the beginning. When I first came up with the Universal Dashboard, it was a dashboard, but it quickly turned into more than that, which we'll see today. So a quick history of Universal Dashboard, if you've never heard of it. In 2017, I released the first version. It was primarily for just kind of generating static HTML pages. You could put charts in there and tables and stuff, and it was mostly just for displaying data. In 2018, kind of the beginning of 2018, I actually upgraded it to use a JavaScript framework called React. And when I added React, I actually built in the ASP.NET web server and that kind of thing so that you could actually kind of take input from users and create dynamic interactive websites. In 2019, there was this like rapid explosion of use and community adoption. People were making custom components for it. People were building all kinds of dashboards and blogging about it and that kind of thing. In 2020, made the decision to kind of merge it with another tool I had built called Universal Automation, and it became PowerShell Universal. So one of the reasons there was the web server was running directly in the PowerShell process, and I wanted to have a little more control over the technology stack. So now PowerShell Universal, rather than being just a PowerShell module, is an ASP.NET Core web app. In 2021, released PowerShell Universal v2, included a whole new admin console and that kind of thing. And 2022, we released v3, and that was actually last week. So whole new version with SQL Server support and that kind of thing. So kind of like the stack now for PowerShell Universal is kind of broken into 3 feature groups. We have APIs, automation, and user interfaces. APIs are RESTful APIs you can call PowerShell scripts with. Automation is like, task scheduler, that kind of thing, but we integrate really, really tightly with the PowerShell host, so you can get things like pipeline output out from it. You can respond to feedback from like things like read host. And then user interfaces, which we're going to be looking at today, are highly interactive websites that you can build with PowerShell. So we have a whole bunch of built-in components. There's a whole bunch of components available on the PowerShell gallery, actually, that come down as PowerShell modules. And we can build some pretty cool UIs with them. There's some other features of PowerShell Universal, like running multiple versions of PowerShell. Everything's configured via PowerShell. We have a security stack. We can store things in a single file database called LightDB or SQL Server. And there's a really robust community around it. So we have some forums that have a lot of people asking questions, building things, kind of sharing their knowledge. So it's been kind of a fun project to work on. So PowerShell Universal Dashboard in general is now part of PowerShell Universal, but it still kind of uses the same concept of PowerShell-based UIs. It is actually a lot of the same code, just migrated into PowerShell Universal, running the same kind of ASP.NET Core web server and the same React library on the front end. So we'll be looking at a bunch of commandlets that you can use to create your UIs. It uses some modern UI libraries. One is MUI. It used to be called Material UI. That is kind of the main UI library we use for PowerShell Universal Dashboard. We also have some Ant design in the mix. That's what our admin console is built with. And then everything is centered around React, which is Facebook's JavaScript library. It's super interactive, so you can actually use WebSockets or it uses WebSockets to communicate with that React front end, so you can actually create user interfaces that are similar to WPF in Windows Forms, like in a web browser. It's super extensible. I'm actually going to get into some of that today. You can actually take React components that you find on Node Package Manager, js.org, and build those into your own custom PowerShell modules that then you can load up inside Universal Dashboard. Being part of the PowerShell Universal platform, it also integrates pretty well with PowerShell Universal itself, so you can integrate with some of those other things like APIs, scripts, and schedules, and that kind of stuff. And it is really easy, well, not really easy. I would say it's possible to style anything. I'll get into some of the, how to do some of the styling and that kind of thing. People really like building it for their company, making it look like their company's websites and using their company's logos and that kind of thing. So it's really adjustable. I wouldn't say necessarily easy. The agenda today, we're going to look at some basic components. I'm going to go through some of the popular ones. Then we'll talk about pages, how you can kind of create multiple pages inside your dashboard, set up some navigation, that kind of thing. Then we'll talk about theming. I'll get kind of the basics of theming. You can go really crazy with the theming, and I've seen all kinds of stuff. Then we'll get into interactivity. I'm going to actually build a chat room with PowerShell Universal, so we can actually, if you guys could get to the web server, you could have a chat going on in there. Then we're going to look at platform integration. I'm going to call some scripts from my dashboard. Then we'll do some debugging inside PowerShell Universal. I'll talk a little bit about what is kind of different about Universal Dashboard versus a regular PowerShell console, because it is different. It uses run spaces in the background. Then we'll look at a custom component. I'm actually going to show off a custom component I built at about 3 a.m. last night because I couldn't sleep. And then I'll talk a little bit about kind of the future of where we're headed with PowerShell Universal and Universal Dashboard. All right, that's all my slides. All right, so PowerShell Universal is cross-platform, and right now I am running this just locally on my machine as an XE. So I just downloaded, I built the thing locally, and I'm running the XE locally. You could do the same thing by just downloading the zip from our website. We also have an MSI installer that installs it as a service. We have a desktop version that just runs as your current user context and kind of puts it in a framed window, that kind of thing. But what we're going to be looking at today are dashboards. So the idea with a dashboard is it depends how you're running them, but particularly it's collections of functionality you could put in a single dashboard, and you can kind of decide on settings for those dashboards. So that's where you would kind of break it up into these different dashboards. It's not necessary to do this for every single page, as I'll show you in a little bit, that you can have multiple pages, but each dashboard has its own kind of set of settings, like the environment it's running in. For example, if you want to do Windows PowerShell or 7.2, all my dashboards right now are currently running in what's called the integrated mode, which means that they're all running within PowerShell Universal. It's its own PowerShell host. So they're all in process, and it's not spawning any other PowerShell processes. But to kind of look at what one of these looks like, you can see here that this is pretty much an empty dashboard. There's nothing on the page. It's got a little title at the top. Actually, don't know if this theme is set up right now, but yeah, typically, by default, it supports light and dark themes, that kind of thing. And the way that's defined is if you actually go to the details here. Actually, what I was going to do here, if I have this available, which I think I do, yeah. All right, so I'm going to use VS Code. I'm going to switch over to a light theme. Whoop. I see, there we go. And we'll make that a little bigger. All right, so as you can see in the bottom here, it's just logging. I'm running PowerShell Universal literally inside this process. And I have the PowerShell Universal VS Code extension installed, so I can actually see my dashboards, the same ones that we actually have in here. So we have this editing experience that you can actually use VS Code rather than PowerShell Universal if you want your IntelliSense and your extensions and all that kind of thing. And then I could open my dashboard file directly in VS Code. So the idea with dashboards are we have lots of commandlets that do different or create different components inside your dashboard. So you can see here that I have my new UD dashboard. It has a title of PowerShell Conference EU 2022, and that is what is producing the title on this page here. From there, I'm actually selecting a theme. So we just added like built-in themes in V3. The Ant design theme is trying to make it look more like the admin console. Because if you don't have that default theme, you're going to be using the Material UI default theme, which looks a little bit different and sometimes is a little bit jarring for people, as you can see here. But I'm just going to kind of go through some of the basic controls that you may use inside a dashboard. So if I want to create an image, I could use the new UD image commandlet. I'm pointing out to the PSConfEU website and grabbing the logo. I have a syntax error in here somewhere, which I think is here, potentially. It's mad. Editing on the fly. Whoa. All right, we're just going to undo that. I don't know what VS Code is doing. All right, I am going to leave this alone, I think. Go back here. All right, we're back to where we started. I don't know what's going on with VS Code. I'll just make this bigger. All right, so if we want to do an image, we could just do new image, specify a URL, save this, and it's going to automatically reload and like put that image on the page. So I went out, created some, it's actually a React component that displays this image. You can also do things like typography. So we have all different kinds of text that you can set. This is using an H4 tag, setting an ID of text, and then putting some text in there. Obviously, that's going to display this text underneath the image. But if you want to get like a little more involved, you could do things like charts. So we have a couple different chart libraries built directly in. This one's called Nevo. And what I'm doing here is I'm just getting some processes, sorting them by their CPU usage, selecting the first 10, and then grabbing some properties, and then I am displaying those in this chart. So you can hover over and kind of see the CPU usage. For some reason, Explorer is using the most CPU right now, and PowerPoint. Additionally, another really highly used component is a table. So you can see here that if I save this, why isn't that working? It's going to reload, and you can see I have the same processes that I was mapping inside my chart. I am now just displaying inside my table, and we have the ability to like render custom column content. So in this final column, I'm actually putting a button in that's capable of just stopping the process. So not only can you like kind of add your components into here, but you can kind of mix in just built-in PowerShell commandlets. So for example, stop processes in here. I'm not going to click that on Explorer though, I don't think. And finally, another kind of frequently used component is a form. So I'm going to create a card with some content, which is a form that has two fields, one being a text box, or both of them being text box, one being a file, one being arguments. And then when that's submitted, I'm going to call some PowerShell script. So I'm going to start a process, and I'm going to show a little toast notification when that happens. So if we save that, and we go to the bottom here, you'll see that I now have this little form. And if I were to do something like Notepad and click Submit, it started Notepad, and it popped up this little toast in the top right that process 25504 started, and that's what this is. So that's kind of the like general concept with dashboards. We have, I think, over 45 controls built in. There's like maps and collapsibles and lists and that kind of thing. So as you saw in my admin console, I have a whole bunch of dashboards, but it's not necessary to actually kind of organize it this way. You could have dashboards that are like your production dashboard, your development dashboard, or your test dashboard, that kind of thing. Or you can set them up into pages. So similar to the URLs that you're seeing here, you can actually nest URLs into pages within your dashboard. So inside this particular dashboard, I have a couple pages. So I have a home page that just displays home. I have another page that is a user's page. It's using the get local user commandlet to get local users on a machine and creating a table. From there, I'm going to display the name, description, I'm going to display a button to actually view more information about that user. And it's going to forward me over to a different page, which in this case, this page accepts a variable. So you can see that :ID in there means that that is a variable section of that URL. And that will just kind of show up inside the content of this page. So then I can use getLocalUser again, and then just pass in the SID from that URL to look up that user and create some more content. I just had like a groups page again. It's just not doing much. At the top here, I'm actually specifying custom navigation. This isn't necessary, but it kind of shows you an example of how I can put icons and like invoke redirect to go to different pages. So now, if we actually view this one, my home page again just doesn't have anything on it. But if I go to the users page, you're going to see that I actually call it getLocalUser. It got that data and it put it into this table. And then we're rendering that column on the right-hand side there with new UD button and new UD table column. So if I were to click view here, it's actually going to redirect, and you can see the URL changed. And that's where that variable portion has come into play. So I have user slash the SID of the user, and then that SID has shown up as an automatic variable inside my page, which allowed me to call getLocalUser again, and then get some information about the user. So if I wanted to, I could put all kinds of information and kind of have a user profile page. All right. So like I said, that's just another way to organize things. Sometimes people will put pages in different files, that kind of thing. One of the things that we added in v3 was the ability to actually view all the files within the configuration folder for PowerShell Universal. So it would be possible to, in my pages folder here, have external files for each page just as a way to organize it. And then you can edit it kind of from this view rather than on the dashboard page. All right. So now I want to talk a little bit about theming, because it seems like everybody wants their dashboard to look, how their company's websites look. So this is actually using a custom theme called Paperbase. I just actually found an example of a Material UI theme called Paperbase and replicated it inside PowerShell Universal. So what this has done is it's like changed the font sizes, it's changed some default colors, it's removed some of the they call it elevation on the button, like the button is flat now. And I'm doing some custom styling here in this red block. But how that works is that there is actually a hash table that you can define. So we have some examples of this. Our built-in themes work the exact same way. And this is actually built on Material UI's theme concept. And they have actually the full definition of their theme on their website. And what you could do is you can actually adjust all these things for your dashboard. So like I said, examples, it's kind of, this is where I said it's yeah, you can do whatever you want. It's not totally straightforward, but as we get more examples, you'll be able to kind of pick and choose what you want. This particular palette doesn't support a black or a dark theme, but you could have light and dark themes in the same kind of theme hash table. And just kind of as an example of updating the theme, I'm going to change the font family of this dashboard to Comic Sans. And now when I reload, you can see that it is now in Comic Sans. It just updated all the stuff inside there. So it's similar to cascading style sheets if you've ever worked with HTML, but it's a little more structured, and there are some calculations going on based on the Material UI library. Additionally, you can actually override individual components. So if you look at this little override section here, I have my drawer and my button, and then you have individual classes underneath those that I'm overriding. So this is how I made my button flat. I turned the text transform off on the label, and then I got rid of the box shadow, that kind of thing. So it made the button look flat. And if you are ever messing around with that, you can actually go out to the Material UI documentation, and you can see that they actually have all their CSS rules here at the bottom. And you can actually use this to generate your themes. So I get a lot of questions about how I did this and how I looked up that information, and this is how, because for every single one of the controls that's in Universal Dashboard, you can come out here and get that information from here and then adjust it inside your dashboard. Obviously, you're going to have to know a little bit of CSS to make that work. The other thing that I did on this page was I used a component called new UD style. And what new UD style does allows you to just kind of encapsulate an individual component and just style that one. So you could have, I styled this red. This card could, based on some sort of like status, maybe you looked something up in a database and the server was down, you could have it red. And if it was up, it was green. So that's kind of how you would style an individual component. All right, so now I want to talk a little bit about the ability to have like interactive components. So we've seen that you can like create forms and you can create tables and charts and that kind of thing. But because we integrate really tightly with SignalR, which is a technology inside ASP.NET Core, it actually uses WebSockets to communicate back and forth between your PowerShell script and that's running the dashboard and the actual React components inside of the dashboard like framework that's running in the browser. What we can do is you can actually build really, really interactive pages that that feel a lot like kind of like web forms or WPF would feel locally. So, for example, we have show UD toast. I actually showed an example of this already, and that just kind of pops up a little toast message. So, in my chat room, I want to toast whenever someone enters the chat. So in this case, I'm using show UD toast. I'm using the user variable, which is going to get the current user name. And then I'm just going to say they joined the room. And I'm using the broadcast parameter of show UD toast. And what that does is it says anyone that's connected to this page, update the page for them. So, or show this toast on every connected user. So let's see what that looks like. So I joined, and now you can see in the top right there that admin has joined the room. But if I were to actually open a new in private window, go here, go to chat room. Oh, I'm going to log in first because it said nobody joined the room there. I'll say Adam. I just have like no authentication pretty much on. And now if I go to chat room, now you can see Adam joined the room. So what's cool about that is if I were to refresh this page, you'll see that it updates on both browsers, because it's actually communicating over WebSockets and broadcasting to everyone that's connected. So the next step to have a chat room is that we need to store messages and users that are connected. So what I'm going to do here is take advantage of a concept inside PowerShell Universal called the cache. So the cache is pretty much an in-memory like hash table. You can kind of think of it like that. We have this special cache scope, and this is shared by all users. So all users will have access to the exact same variable here. And the reason that we have to use a cache scope instead of like global or script or anything like that is because we are using multiple run spaces in the background for dashboards. And in this case, we just kind of like more or less inject this cache scope into all those places, and we're accessing the same variables across all those run spaces. So now when one of the users loads the page, we check to see if the messages exists or the guest list exists, and then we are going to create those if they don't. Then we'll add the user to the guest list. The next step is to actually create our chat room. So I'll just kind of step through this quickly. And you can see I'm just using rows and columns to kind of organize it. On the left-hand column, I'm going to have a new UD dynamic, which is a section of the dashboard that you can automatically reload, either on an interval or when certain things happen. And then I'm going to take all the messages that are in that cache variable, join them together into like a single string, and then put them into a multi-line text box. So that's going to be like the chat room. On the right-hand side, we'll have the guest list, which is just a new UD list. And we're just taking that guest list and creating list items to put inside that list. So we'll save that. And now you can see admin and Adam are now in the chat room. There's this chat message box here, but there's no chat messages in it yet. But we got our guest list. So in order to add messages, we have to have a little text box or form or something like that to type something in there. So I'm going to create a form. It's going to have a single text box in it. And when it's submitted, it's going to do a bunch of different things. First of all, it's going to format a message. It's going to get the current date, the user that's submitting the message. We have this like special event data variable that shows up in pretty much all of our like event handlers. And in this case, I'm accessing the message. And then I'm going to format that message, add it to the message cache. I'm going to call sync UD element on the chat room. So what that does, and with broadcast, so for all users, and what that does is it's actually going to refresh this section here. So if you look in here, you can see that what's going to happen is it's going to rerun this section of code. It's going to get my messages, it's going to create my one big message string, it's going to put it in the text box. And then finally, it's just going to clear out the message text box so that you can't just spam the chat room. So save that, and it's going to reload. And now I have this little message text box down here. Probably should have it go across the screen, but I can say hello. And now when I click submit, you can see admin said hello at that time. It cleared out the message box and it put it into the chat room. If I go over to my other chat room window, you can see that it showed up there as well because we had the broadcast on and it's reloading those messages. So, oops, if I could spell howdy. But now you can see it works back and forth because it's broadcasting across all connected WebSockets. All right. Finally, I had created like a little floating action button, which they appear in like the bottom left here. You can see this little guy. And if you click that, it's going to show a modal. I wanted to show that you could pop modals, and modals like go over the top of the page, and you could put additional content there. People typically use those for showing just, additional information or things like this, where you could have clearing of the chat room. So it cleared the chat room there. Should have cleared the chat room here. So it actually went out, and I think the implementation of that was to actually creates a new list and more or less wipes out all the messages. All right, so that's kind of integration. Like you can go crazy with a lot of that stuff. You can actually set properties on different components and all this kind of thing. But I want to talk about debugging because, as I said earlier, it's a different environment, and people like when they first start playing with PowerShell Universal Dashboard, they're like, my script works locally, but it doesn't work in Universal Dashboard. Why? And there's lots of reasons for that. It could be like permissions. It could be you're running it as a service. It can't access certain things. It's not running as your user, so it doesn't have certain modules installed. That kind of thing. There's lots of things that could happen. First of all, there is a log tab here that. When you look at that, it should, well, if I restart this, it'll at least print something. But you can put stuff into the log via like write host and that kind of thing. Or it will automatically display errors. So for example, this button, when I click it, it's going to throw an exception. It is actually going to display errors for both terminating and non-terminating, just because otherwise there's like no way to surface that, and like sometimes things aren't working and you don't know why. So if I click that, you can see "oh no" popped up in the bottom left there. That's automatic. You can turn it off if you want, if you have some like noisy commandlets, that kind of thing. But the other thing you can do is you can either use debug PSU dashboard, which is pretty cool. I'll show you in a sec, or wait debugger. So PSU debug dashboard, what that does is if I click this error, it's actually going to pop up this little message box anywhere that you put that in there, and it's going to say like, this is the PowerShell process that's running. Here's the commands you can run to actually attach to PowerShell Universal and debug this run space. So as you can see, it's got the process ID, and then we're on run space 114 because it's just auto-generating run spaces in the background. So it does make it kind of hard to debug. But if I came over to a PowerShell process like this one, you can see I entered the PS host process, and now I'm sitting inside my script on wait debugger, which is inside PSU or debug PSU dashboard. So then you could start to step through your script, evaluate different variables in there and that kind of thing. And that's just kind of one way to do it. The other thing that you can do is click this debug with VS Code or VS Insiders. It's going to run the same command. You have to have the PowerShell Universal module to be, or extension to be installed in VS Code for that to work. And you could do the same thing manually with wait debugger. You'd kind of have to do some digging around a little bit. This is just kind of a helper thing to kind of find the process ID and run space ID that is running. All right. This is a whirlwind of stuff. And let's see, what do I want to talk about first? I think I'm going to talk about components, and then I'll talk about integration. So we have a whole library of, or marketplace of components. We call it marketplace, but it's pretty much just modules that are on the PowerShell gallery that we're like synchronizing with marketplace.universal-dashboard.io. And these are either modules I've created or other people have created. And you can actually download and install these, and all they are PowerShell modules with some JavaScript. And I'll show you in a sec how we actually create the JavaScript for this. And typically, most of these modules are just a PowerShell PSM1 file that returns a hash table and then a JavaScript file that gets registered with PowerShell Universal, and then it can add custom components. So I need to open the one that I created at 3 in the morning. This one is called UD Joyride. So from a PowerShell standpoint, like the way you interface with this is pretty much a standard advanced function. So I have a new UD Joyride function. It accepts an ID, which is auto-generated by default. We have a hash table of steps. I'll talk a little bit about, well, I'll show you what UD Joyride is in a second. But the idea is it kind of gives you a demo step-through, walkthrough of the dashboard. You can choose to run it. You can say whether or not you want it to be continuous. And then we have our steps, so a target component, some text that we want to display for that component, where to place it, that kind of thing. And you can see there's a bunch of stuff in here, a bunch of stuff that you probably don't use in PowerShell on a day-to-day basis, like webpack config and package.json and babel RC file. And even I can't remember how to like generate this all the time. So what we have is actually a template repository in GitHub. So if you say, click use this template, it will automatically create a repo in your organization or account. And then from there, you can just modify that and add your components. And we have like a whole README file about how to customize it and build it and that kind of thing. And the way it works is if you have invoke build installed, it's actually going to just call this component.build file. And it will do the whole node install and packaging for you. So we have some like default Webpack settings and all that kind of thing. I won't get too invoke Webpack, invoke build. I won't get too into the detail or the nitty gritty of the JavaScript here, but I'll just show you that like really there's not a lot going on because I am importing this React Joyride library, which comes from NPM. I just found actually there's this cool GitHub repository called Awesome React Components, and I just like went through this list and found something cool. And I installed that into here, and now I realize this is probably very foreign to everyone, but I just want to show there's not much code here. You know, I'm pretty much taking this props, which is a hash table generated from here. So this hash table is being serialized to JSON, and then it is being passed in here. That's pretty much what's happening. So I have built this, and what that produces is my PSD1, my PSM1. I have some like registration stuff at the top, and then these JavaScript files have been generated based on my component here. So what's cool about that is if I go back to wherever Universal Dashboard is, I can use my React Joyride component. So I actually have this at the bottom. First, what I'm going to do is I'm going to import this module. So it's just a PowerShell module. So that's going to register it with Universal Dashboard, register those JavaScript files, and provide new UD Joyride to my environment. And then I'm going to add a couple things to my dashboard. So I have a button, and what that's going to do is it's going to find this Joyride component and call set UD element on it and say run. So start running the Joyride. And then we have some steps. So pretty much what I'm doing here is I have a step and a target. And if you look through here, you'll see that I have IDs. So ID image, ID text, I think I have my chart. And those are what are referenced here. So now, if everything works properly, I should be able to do this. And we have this little start button. And if I click that, you can see this little thing popped up. So that's actually the React Joyride component that I just built. So I didn't have to worry about writing a whole bunch of JavaScript. Someone already did that with this really cool library. And if I click that, it's going to start showing my steps. So it highlighted the image because that's the target I told it to highlight. And as you kind of step through it, you know, it has different ways to step through it, but now it's highlighting some text, it's highlighting my table, and then it's highlighting my form. So it's kind of a way to, like, you know, make they call it joyride through your application. So that's kind of like a really quick run through of like how custom components are built. And we tried to make it really easy to quickly build these because there's so many cool React components. And I wanted to be able to quickly build them. And now I can go and publish this on the PowerShell gallery, and you can use Joyride inside your dashboards. All right. Finally, the last thing I want to talk about, I'm going to skip the integration thing because I'm running a little long, but I kind of want to talk about kind of what we're thinking going forward for Universal Dashboard. If anyone has like used Universal Dashboard, I feel like some of this is probably familiar. Like this type of scripting and that kind of thing to create your dashboards is familiar. But you'll notice that in Universal Automation, we now have this like pages functionality. I've already gotten some questions. It's like, I know it's confusing, so we're trying to figure out like what's the best way to move forward to make this, you know, less confusing, because now there's like 2 ways to build UIs. But the idea being that PowerShell Universal Dashboard is extremely flexible. As you can see, I can bring in new components. I can build components that talk over WebSockets. I could build a chat room, that kind of thing. But with the pages functionality, we were trying to make it like easier to like lay out stuff and add new components and that kind of thing. So this is the page designer. And the idea being you can click edit and I can like move things around and I can like make them bigger and smaller. And then I have a toolbox so I can add new components. But you'll notice right here, I actually have this component, which looks a little different. As you notice, like when I refresh this page, it loads later. And what that actually is just we're embedding a dashboard in there. So if we go back to dashboards, you'll see I have slash component here. And that's that table. So I've kind of gotten rid of all the like header and navigation and that kind of thing. It's just that component. And I've been able to embed that into my page. So what we're kind of thinking is that eventually I would like to surface this inside the toolbox. So you would see your own custom components that are based on PowerShell Universal Dashboard. But you can drag and drop them, lay things out really easily. What's cool about the page designer is like, okay, I can lay it out when my screen's larger. If I make it smaller, I can lay it out again, and then it will respond differently based on screen sizes and that kind of thing. So, and it's a little bit easier. The learning curve's lower because you can actually, if you look at any one of these components, you hit the properties and you just see them all. You don't have to like learn a whole PowerShell module to create your UI. So we're trying to think of ways to make it super flexible with PowerShell Universal Dashboard, and then, you know, at the same time have it like a little bit easier to lay things out and surface properties that you may want to put on components. Because what I'm thinking about doing is with components like this one that I just created, rather than having like new UD dashboard and that kind of thing, it would be like a function. And that function would have parameters, and those parameters would show up in the page designer. So then you could create really, really cool components based on Universal Dashboard and then lay them out in pages. All right. Yeah, so I'm going to call it there for demos, just so that we have a little time for questions. And on my Q&A slide, I have a URL. If you load, if you go to that and you type in how many hours it took me to travel here, you can get a free license of PowerShell Universal. So with that, I am going to open it up to questions. Yeah.
You used the cache name scope. Any particular
I use the cache here. You mean for the chat room? I use that scope so that all the users would have this access to the same variable.
Yeah, well, why not use global?
Oh, because we are going cross-run space, and global doesn't work cross-run space. Yeah. There's also a session cache as well. So those are custom scopes that we made. Cache being shared by all users, and there's a session scope that is user specific. So if someone's like clicking around in a page, you can have it set those session variables, and then it will reload load from there, and it won't be shared across user sessions.
I have a question about cache, because I never tried it. Does cache works across different engines, like different environments, or is it just limited to one environment?
The cache scope is limited to one environment, but we also have set PSU cache, which is confusing. I'm considering like maybe merging those two. The problem is that cache scope actually stores the actual live object, and it'd be a breaking change to merge the two, because what set PSU cache does is it takes the object, PS serializes it, and then stores it in the server. So then you can actually use it on all your environments. So there's set PSU cache, get PSU cache, but it's using a serialized version. So, yeah. But yeah, that would be one.
One of the functionalities that I like very much about is the charts that you can use.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering, is it going to be easy to create a chart or something that's there yet that has a history, so you can kind of slide back into time?
You could. It would probably take a little bit of work. We also have UD Monitor, which is technically, yeah, it's a little different, yeah.
Back in the past of
Right.
From like a database or something.
Yeah, right. And that's, like I said, it's not really possible right now. You'd have to like merge two components. Like you'd have to have a slider component, and then it would have to update the chart based on the slider kind of thing. But always open to feedback. So if you have like, like this specific thing, definitely open a GitHub issue, and I like making new components. So yeah, okay. Yeah.
I've seen the top of the browser that there is a licensing. Is there a license to buy for using PowerShell Universal?
Yeah, so there's certain functionality that is not available when you don't have licenses. Everything I showed here, you don't need a license for. Certain things like enforcing authentication and role-based access on the dashboards themselves. As you saw before, I actually could access the dashboard without logging in. That's not provided. There's like other things that are like, I think there's like certain things like debugging things here that aren't provided, but you get a lot of functionality for free, so yeah. And we have like personal license versus, like an organizational license. Our personal license is like way cheaper, so. Anything else?
Are
Yeah.
there some community examples you could use for
Yeah, so there's a couple things that you could do there. What I find is a lot of people can't share because it's like IP for their companies. We have templates. So these are primarily things that I have made. Some people have made some other templates. And what a template is it's effectively a zip file, and then you can load it into PowerShell Universal, and it just configures it automatically. It like extracts it into your configuration directory. So yeah, there's a bunch of examples here. The other place that if you just want like some ideas, like you're not going to get a lot of code, we actually have this customer examples page. But if you go to provide an example, it just takes you to the forums. And I couldn't keep up with that customer example page because people just kept adding examples of what they're doing with PowerShell Universal here. So if you want like some just ideas of what you could do, definitely check out this thread. And there's just a whole bunch of stuff that, I don't know, maybe even people in this room have added to this real world examples thread. So, but yeah, that you can get to that from ironmansoftware.com. So, anybody else? Cool. Well, I'll be around, so if you have any other questions, find me in the hallway, and thanks for coming.